Season 8 will be going live as this video is posted. With MAUGA and the somewhat controversial balance changes, we'll have to get more playtime before we have a bigger, in-depth understanding of what is even going on with some of those wacky decisions they're trying. Two Overwatch developers did an interview on Flats and Emong's stream where they discussed a lot of the recent changes as well as alluded to the systematic, major, foundational changes that they're looking to do soon in the next season or seasons to come. Those are the ones that I think are most impactful, but they also hinted at format changes, which I'm personally most excited about. Things such as limiting the number of swaps you might have or hero bans. Yes, my prediction came true, that they're willing to test out some of these ideas to at least nudge the format in a more playable direction. I'll have a lot more to say about that as it's my favorite subject, but those are more in the testing phase, it sounds like. Let's start off with the things that seem a little bit more certain. They clued at some of these, but the clues they gave, I think, were rather obvious in the direction they've gone, especially since we've had enough time now with these new devs. I feel like I'm more confident in knowing what they mean when they say certain things. So what they did say is that they're kind of happy with where crowd control is, but perhaps the aftermath of crowd control is the real problem. Maybe it's not getting hit with so many stuns, but feeling like you get hit with a stun and then blow up immediately. In Season 9, they're looking at systematic changes to the entire game that they think will help tank heroes overall, looking at how they can adjust healing and burst damage specifically. So as Alec explains it, perhaps after you get CC'd, you don't feel like you always get bursted down and deleted as a tank hero. Whoa, what does that mean? Now, they're also going to talk about passives in general in the rest of this conversation, but something that I think they're kind of cluing into is perhaps, would tanks have more damage and maybe even healing reduction? That sounds kind of crazy, but think of it this way. The breakpoints on squishies are so descript. They could set the healing values differently on either category of player. A regenerative burst on Baptiste has a much different impact whether it hits a squishy or a tank. I'd argue, actually, the burst healing is a bit more oppressive on squishy characters because the volume of damage you need for a tank anyway is already so high, it doesn't make my experience feel worse. However, everybody shoots at the tank usually, so they catch a lot of that. Let me give you a different example. Most damage players, I think, know how brutal it can feel to go up against another damage player who has a mercy pocket. So whatever resources that squishy gets amplifies its effect, whereas a mercy pocket on a tank is not so threatening. So perhaps that's baked into the passives of tanks. In this interview, he also did slip that these systematic changes they're thinking about should help a character like Reinhardt. Another theory I have is if they're talking about healing and burst damage being nerfed, maybe there's a big global change to all the stats in the game. We've had quite the power up era of the game. The power creep era of the game came quicker than even it did in Overwatch 1, I think. So maybe now that they're at that like yearly reset point where they're toying with things, maybe we'll get a major downscale and downshift of everything. And if the game's more simplified, then the extra stats that tank heroes have inherently with more health might feel more impactful, relatively speaking, to the rest of the stats of the game. Of course, we're playing a little bit of Blizzard Whisperer here, but I also did do that to predict correctly that they'll be trying hero bans in the next year. In fact, it sounds even sooner than that. So this is the best guess we have now. Let me know your guesses for what exactly they could mean with those quotes. Specifically lessening the healing and burst damage overall in the game, reorganizing it in a way where tanks benefit. Here's another one that they're looking at. This one, they're in wait and see mode. They use this a few times in the conversation where, let me get the exact quote of how they said that. They're in the process of evaluating, which means they're like planning to plan, gaining data to begin to make the decision-making process. This one, they're looking at Ana. They're adding a new tank, which is severely impacted by Ana, but they did just buff the counter to Ana nade in Kiriko, but perhaps they don't like the mechanic to begin with, of it being so bursty in nature. It hits you, you're screwed. It hits you, you're cleansed, you're fine. It's a bit all or nothing with the way the abilities act. I have mixed opinions about that. I think the grass isn't always greener on the other side, and you have to be careful. What they specifically said is they'll look at Ana and perhaps rework it or retune it to be similar to the way that Zen's Discord works now. Zen's Discord now has an interesting outplay where you can't just keep it on the tank indefinitely if they outplay it. Take some cover, wait it out, go back in, and the Discord's got to go someplace else. I still think it's crazy strong and still zones out the tank a lot, but now you have a chance. and you can't just infinitely keep recasting it on you. They might do a similar thing like that to On a Nade. And that change is so inventive, I think. And if we look at the theme of how they've made changes currently so far, they usually like to keep the impact, but just punish the window a little bit more. But at the same time, say they're looking at the burst of healing and damage in the game. Personally, I'd say I don't really mind how impactful a lot of things are, including On a Nade. There's a lot of ways to make things blow up in this game, but I prefer that to the game sort of being muted down and we're just like pillow fighting one another, which is also why I don't find immortalities so oppressive, because the alternative is we just make everything blow up always. Well, now you have an ability that at least is one extra counterplay on the stack of things that make you explode. But when it's not in play, things explode anyway. Not as much mobility skill involved in burst, impact, power creep Overwatch, but I find it still pretty fun. I haven't hated this version of the game. In fact, in this season, I've played the most out of any season in Overwatch 2. Also based on my time, interest level, and dedication to wanting to improve. But I like this version of the game at the moment. But I also really liked the DPS-centric Genji era, where Lucio and Kiriko were by far and away the best supports. Okay, let's talk about some other changes that they're looking at. They want to make the DPS passive more meaningful. And while I personally would like movement being buffed, and just feel free to put that old DPS passive back to try to level the scales against how powerful the support passive is, it doesn't sound like they're going to do that because they said the move speed messed up your aim. And something that I think balance nerds forget about when the devs often make changes is that they really care, and they should care, about the playability of the average player's experience, which often isn't balance reliant, but just mechanics reliant. So if you're playing Widow or Cassidy with fine-tuned AD strafing into a shot, and then all of a sudden you get into limb, perhaps even off screen of something you tagged and your teammate cleans up, and now you're moving faster, throwing your aim off, that's unnecessary frustration for a lot of characters, even though it's a buff to you. So oddly enough, that's a thing they're not going to do, it sounds like. But I don't play aim heroes, so I'm fine with the movement speed. Let me get in there faster with Genji. But okay, something that helps them instead. So they've pretty much all but admitted that there will be a DPS passive buff in Season 9, it sounds like. Something that helps them sort of in a similar way that the support passive works, they seemed to imply. So if we think about the support passive and the positions they want to play in the backline, the support passive really helps them look after themselves. They don't want to necessarily be going aggressive, although it does help them do that. It helps them play around cover and shake off some of the harassment they might otherwise get. So if that's the personality of what a support is aiming to do, and I also think the speed buff did make sense for damage, what's like another thing that possibly would do that for the playstyle that damage heroes have? Well, if they reduce the burst damage in the game baseline, is there some buff that damage might get that puts it back, right? So if they remove power on one side, maybe they give that to damage in another way, either on elimination or something like that. Bit of a kooky idea. They tried that reload speed at different values. Overall, not that useful. When you're playing horde mode against the enemy's respawn advantage as you're capping C on a given map, I like it there, but basically everywhere else, it's pretty much irrelevant. How about just a flat movement buff? Maybe that. Is that too strong? I don't know. Supports have 4 cooldowns each and are DPS at the same time. It doesn't seem too crazy to me. I think the damage category is the one that's lacking the most. Tanks feel like they're getting countered, but I think they have a ton of power still, especially syncing up with supports, which are so strong. Damage is the weakest role by far, in my opinion, so a meaningful passive, I think, would go far to help their gameplay. That one, too, a bit speculative, but that is going to be changing. So a few major things in Season 9 seems like healing and burst damage nerfed, systematic changes that should help tanks overall, and a new DPS passive. Moving on to some general subjects now, some philosophy, as well as responding to current things. The devs got asked the question on movement creep. Will they keep designing heroes in future that have movement abilities, especially knowing the next few that we're getting? One goes underground, one jumps in the air, it seems like. They give a rather interesting answer here in saying that if a hero doesn't have movement, they have a lot to compensate for. An old term they used to use is power budget, which they try to level out what strengths a character has and give them weaker or stronger abilities to compensate, basically, for whatever strengths or weaknesses they have. So when a hero doesn't have mobility, they have to have huge impact somehow, and that makes them rather sharp. Whereas when they do have mobility, they're always going to have an option to interact with the game. That being said though, one of their more important aims in the game is keeping hero diversity, every hero feeling very unique. So they certainly don't want it to feel like every hero has a certain requirement for movement or something. So perhaps after this next flock of heroes, we might see more static playstyles begin to emerge in Overwatch 2. But if you think about it, all the new heroes and even some of the reworks add mobility. Even a character like Ramatra, who in theory doesn't have much mobility, one of his major buffs that put him into relevance was a big move speed buff on his transform. So even there, they just like threw mobility at the problem to make him work. Now here's two heroes that they have some ideas with, similar to what I said about Ana earlier, where they're in the process of evaluating, Wrecking Ball and Genji. They spoke a little bit more about Ball, but Genji is in this boat with them. For Wrecking Ball, they're trying to decide if they're going to rework or upgrade him. They're currently in the prototyping phase. Again, often they're not trying to necessarily deal with just balance alone in some of these ideas, but more fundamental gameplay issues. So one example is players struggle to play with Wrecking Ball, and they want to make his teammates feel happier to have a Wrecking Ball on their team, but not take away how special he is. Now, Wrecking Ball's one of my favorite characters in the history of the game. Once in a while, a character skill set just meshes with you, and Ball, for me, always has been one of the ones I was better at. A few problems that I know Ball has is that tanks often are plug and play as frontline brawlers in this game. So skirmishing too much just doesn't fit with a lot of the heroes that need a tank just in front of them to help do their thing. However, there also is characters that do like to have that skirmishy, flanky playstyle, which Ball is like uniquely fit to work with, but his skill expression isn't quite as severe as Doomfist, so Doom is typically perceived as stronger, but I do find Ball to be quite underrated actually. Outplay a CC here or there. You got an improved matchup against the rework Sombra. I made a whole video about Wrecking Ball and the situations where I think he is good, but he's a bit of a niche playstyle, and yes, players don't know how to play with him a lot of times, so he's tricky. I was a huge fan of how they handled Roadhog, and like the decision they went with, they did attempt to make Hog more of a teammate to give him AoE healing. They said in this interview they did some tests, and the healing numbers felt the same, and it was sort of incidental when you were helping your team with healing. And in previous interviews, they said adding more healing creep didn't feel right. So instead, it's more of a personal ability for him still, but just more forgiving in that he can't be stunned out of it. And then Pigpen is an ability I'm a huge fan of. Feels like half of an extra hook in terms of the CC that you have to work with. Made Hog one of my favorite heroes now in the tank category. Little pocket pick. Ball's another one of those I have. And what I would like them to do is double down on Ball's playstyle in some way. I think a lot of Wrecking Balls may cringe at what I might suggest now, but honestly, I think Ball's abilities aren't so impactful in comparison to the other damage that tanks normally do, that they probably could get away from how map specific his kit is, in that you can do cute little tricks like roll off of an edge in order to pile drive down. What if you could just leap in the air and do pile driver normally, just like in front all the time? I don't think that's so crazy for a shieldless tank in the game, and maybe a bit less of the extreme mobility, but more localized to the brawl. Something useful there. Adaptive shield is nice, but it's sort of boring in the tank category right now, especially in combination with how complex a lot of the tank abilities have become. Maybe there's other statuses they could give it to make it more interesting. They made comments about the new Sombra rework, as well as the EMP buff that's kind of getting reinstated. The reason for the recent EMP buff that went through today was that it was a bit too muddled where the value was coming from. Because yeah, you had like a second-ish of ability lockout, but it was supposed to be valued to her damage. Isn't really what the character's about anyway, so they're just giving like a bit of a middle point for that. I still think the EMP is like hard to use. Like the game sense and timing it's required to actually use it effectively is still surprisingly difficult. My biggest Sombra tip for you guys though is like, you're in Viz, look behind, wait for your team to be fighting, then do it. I don't know why every Sombra wants to go invis in front of their team to EMP 5 and you've got like one teammate in the fight. Like that's the biggest mistake, basically. The other one I would say, there's some pretty easy to cancel ultimates that are channeling, like Sigma or Cassidy's ult, just interrupting an enemy ult, then getting the effect. I think that's pretty strong. But overall, Interestingly enough, despite them reporting in the previous blog post that Sombra's win rate is kind of low, she's more popular now. Whereas before, she maybe was a hero that specialists tried more so. More players are trying to use her. Now, is that because of the rework or because she seems like an easy answer to certain things, which turns out to not be the case, funnily enough? It's like that dive tank's running at you and you think you're just going to hack him and then easily kill him, and it doesn't work that way. You have to actually hack them when your team can follow up. A lot of times, like against a Wrecking Ball or Doomfist, it might be better to just like pump damage into them first and wait to hack until they're trying to escape. That's the key tip for you. Don't hack at the start unless you've got lots of damage there waiting to actually punish them. Hack at the end when they're trying to use their escapes. Oh no, Ball, you can't roll away. Or when Doomfist is blocking. Okay, now we get to my favorite part of the conversation. They just sort of slipped in there right at the end of the interview, almost as an extension of the 15% ult retain nerf that they're putting through. Just the concept of hero swapping in general, how they're looking at it as the format of the game. They want hero swapping to be rewarded, but they don't want it to be counterwatch, where the counterpicking is too severe. Of course, the whole premise of counterpicking is completely contradicted by the things that they told us at the launch of the game. I am certain that we'll discuss that on this week's Group Up podcast, as this is a subject SVB is particularly mad about. And I, of course, have been quite mad about several of the things that they lied about at the start of the game. Trying to let that be water under the bridge as I enjoy the current version of the game. But I get a little bit more excited when they're talking about format changes. So they want to think about what swapping means. Like they give an example here. What if you had to spend a token or a currency on how many swaps so that it's limited? Now I'm curious on how that might work. Like if you swap to a hero, does your team run out of swaps or do you run out of swaps? Because each role has limited room on how many swaps they even could do because of how many heroes are available. And then once you do swap, now do you have that roster you can go to? Or do you end up being stuck on the last hero you swapped to? Probably not that, right? But these are questions I'd like them to answer. Essentially what this would be, kind of interestingly, is like a reverse way to hero draft, where you still get the dynamic, quick, jump in, pick up and play aspect, but then it gets more complicated as the game goes on. And it sort of thins out that infinite wheel of counterpicking that you can do, because at the moment you can infinitely counterpick, which let's say in a 10-minute game of push, which I would argue the only way push can be deemed a highly competitive gameplay mode is if counterpicking happens. So you have to do it, but should you do it every team fight? You have to play some sort of psychological warfare with the enemy to see how many times you can push them into another hero? That gets a little bit obnoxious, of course. When does the meta swapping end and we just get to play the game? I think something that is just entirely forgotten by a lot of the critics of Overwatch 2 is the benefit that being able to counterpick has in 5v5. In Overwatch 1, the team comps were so strong, one individual could not counterpick. You would just brutally lose. Now you can brutally counterpick, and it's a bit too free, but that's a better problem to have rather than feeling like no hero you pick can make a difference in how the match goes. Letting every individual control that at least a bit for yourself matters a lot, because you get teammates that aren't ever going to swap. It gets a little bit ridiculous though, that it feels like I have to play something like 75% plus of the entire category of hero that I'm in if I want to be a counter pick Andy. And then at some point, Alec Dawson just wanted to slip in a little present to me, a gift, my safe word actually, hero bans. They said they're going to try picks and bans along with these other formats, basically to try to limit hero swapping and the severity of it. Overall, they're not done looking at the principle of hero swapping. And I like this conversation because I think the current form of Overwatch 2 that we have in year 2 now, the start of it, feels like Dota all pick. Dota is a game that has like severe punishes, out of position, get hit with a stun, burst damage, burst abilities in general. But then Overwatch has the added layer of it's sort of like a fighting game too, where the roster of characters are some like severe matchups. But it's even worse than that. It's like the Pokemon version of a fighting game, where it's kind of rock, paper, scissors a little bit, where you don't have any limitation on how you're going about it. And it's kind of just based on the player base's knowledge or ability to select those counters And thankfully, our community doesn't play every hero. There's too many heroes at this point with too many different skill sets. Otherwise, this could be a lot worse. Like if everyone had the potential to play everything, then the game would functionally play a lot worse and I'd be a lot less happy. Sort of like how the top tier players are less happy. The higher skill you are, the less you'll be satisfied with our current format, because higher tier players are going to exploit Kiriko, for example, to her max potential. But then in like 90% of skill tiers, she has a negative win rate. So it's like, is she really a problem or is she a high tier problem? And in my opinion, the high tier in this game will always have problems with something. It was Widowmaker, it was Sojourn, it was Kiriko, it was whoever. It's always going to be something. So because of that, you need the format to be more complicated in order to reduce the severity of some of those top tier picks. It would be very hard to imagine a full hero draft, full-on nerdy mode that takes a while. I would like to see some tournaments try this now that we don't have Overwatch League, but it's so slow and takes so long, and matches in Overwatch are so short that it's kind of silly. But maybe we could do a combination of that. Maybe you start off with one ban at the start, and then you also get into this like limited hero swap reverse draft, where as you get limited swaps over time, the hero roster will get thinned out based on your hero swap decisions through the match. Oh, and another key point to make is that it's very important to remember that in ranked, we play best of one. So it's kind of all pick best of one, which is a problem. One that almost no one, I don't think any content creator has brought this up, that this is our format, because we don't really ever need to differentiate it from other formats. In a competitive game, especially one that has like shorter matches, you typically always need multiple maps or matches or stages or whatever in order to really figure out who's better. In every sport, game, esport that I know of, a best of one is typically seen as the more chaotic format, because who knows what you're going to pull out on their first go as you're revealing what you're good at. And you have a bit of what's called puncher's chance. You guys know I love sports analogies. Puncher's chance is like, even if you are the underdog in the boxing fight, if you just land a hit early, it might throw the guy off and all of a sudden you're the world champion. That can happen. And Overwatch feels like that to me, where it's like, oh my God, they play this hero really well that I forgot how to deal with, and your whole team is scrambling to trying to figure it out. If you had another chance to deal with that exact matchup, you might feel a little differently, because I think that happens a little bit in Overwatch games where some goofy gimmick, flanking Moira or whatever it is, throws you off early, but you sort of learn to deal with it later in the match in subsequent either stages, checkpoints, rounds, whatever the mode is. And it's sort of how fast do you adapt, and can you adapt? That best of one format is kind of limiting. We have to realize that that's what we usually play. We need the format to be able to smooth some of those rough edges over, to make the game feel more playable. We've been at Overwatch 1.5 for quite a while, but as soon as they start getting this in there, ooh, baby, that's a bit of Overwatch 2 right there. That's that Overwatch 2 flavor. Start getting that new car smell up in here. Transforming the format, I mean, yeah, I'm all on board. Some of that stuff we're gonna see in Season 9. I'm excited to jump into Season 8 now and start testing out how this rather bold and perhaps wacky, terrible, great, I don't know, patch plays out this week. Let me know your thoughts on the patch and as well all the topics we covered in today's video in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it a like, and don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos come out. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time. Okay, so in this recording originally, I definitely called him Kenny Rogers, the singer. And in a previous video, I'm confident that Dion, the art director, in the past, I've called him Deion Sanders, the legendary football player, now turned college coach. And you know what? I almost want to just keep doing it. Who's team dyslexia with me? Should I keep messing up all of their names and start calling, I don't know, Aaron Keller, Aaron Rodgers or something? Or Aaron Paul? I don't know. I still like Uncle A.A. Ron.